right. Well, what I want to talk about today was something that had been on my mind for a while. So I sort of picked the topic of trying to live by our values, what it would take for us to live by our values. This can be a really uncomfortable conversation for people. I've found. I've tried to talk about it in a few different contexts, and people tend to be very uncomfortable discussing this because it requires a certain amount of vulnerability. That is, to have a really productive conversation about how to live up to our values, you've got to start by admitting that you're not doing it right, that you're failing to live up to your values in some way or another. There we go. I finally got it reset. That you're failing to live up to your values in some way or another, right? And so it's a difficult conversation because it requires vulnerability on our part to recognize that we aren't doing something that we think we should do, that we aren't living up to it in the way that we think we should. And that both can be a matter of the way that we appear to other people, the way we look right to other people, and just the fact that it's difficult, it feels bad, right, to think about it, that I'm some sort of failure, that I'm not doing everything that I should do. But it's actually an old concept, these idea of looking at what you might call ordinary vices. So, I mean, hypocrisy is an example of an ordinary vice. I mean, sometimes you have flagrant, extraordinary examples of that, and I'm sure we can all think of various politicians or something like that who've gone beyond that. But in ordinary life, we often do make ourselves into hypocrites a little bit by calling someone out for something or criticizing someone for something that we have done, or maybe even that we continue to do in some small way, right? I think people are often a bit more judgmental than they like to say that they are. They often have a bit more bias and will criticize others for that even when they have it. And we can be a little bit selfish. I think these are all very ordinary vices. So they're common feelings. I'm not thinking of the extraordinary cases and the villains. I'm thinking of the little ways that we fail to live up to our values. So the quote that I put on the website for this one comes from the Bible. Actually, it's one of the few Bible quotes that I know well, but I like the way that the King James Bible puts it, right? It says, "For the good that I would do, I do not. And the evil which I would not do, that I do," right? So the question is, why am I doing the evil that I said that I would not do and that I regret doing? All right, well, to think about this and to brainstorm some ways we might be able to overcome it, we have to think a little bit about what we are like what sorts of creatures we are, how we behave, in order to make sense of how we fail to live up to our own values, to values that we have. One thing that's different about human beings in comparison to other animals is that we do have values or priorities in a way that they generally don't. So if we think about my dogs, like, they want to be fed, they want to go outside, they want to play, but they don't ever sit down and say, okay, my priorities are to do it like this, and so I want to do this one first, and that'll give me time to get to the second one, and then I can save the best one for last. They don't plan it in that way. They don't rank it in that way. There's just sort of an immediate excitement about a possibility of doing something that they want to do. They move from moment to moment, right? Being excited by the next thing that happens. They do have a sense of time. I don't want to say that they don't, but they don't have values in the same way that we might. Because for us, we don't just sort of, go back and forth or go inside or outside or just get blown around. Humans can say, this is my priority, right? This is the goal that I have here. And therefore take various steps along the way to get to that goal, right? I have a final end, that's what it might be called, like a goal that is the final one, that this is what I'm doing it all for, and then instrumental goals along the way that help me to get to that goal. And this organizes our lives and kind of brings us together into what it might be a person, right? To be one individual rather than multiple creatures. Say, I've got some values, I've got a direction that I'm going for. I'm not just being blown around by the events around me. And that can give me a reason to do something, right? So it's not just that I feel like it. It's not just that I want to. It's like, no, I'm going to, I don't know, spend time studying, spend time developing a packet, right, for doing publicity. I'm going to spend time on the phone talking about this project because what I want to do, my goal is to get somewhere else. So now I can have reasons that govern my life. I can have a sort of stability to it. So values play an important part in making us be a person and bringing us together and allowing us to be rational about the way that we structure our lives. We need to have values to be able to do that. So what holds us back? Why don't we live up to our values? The answer, of course, is that we're not simply rational. And our conversation a couple weeks ago with Abbas highlighted some of the ways that we're not simply rational, that the brain can be hacked in one way or another. That being a person in the sense of being consistent, of acting consistently on the reasons that we have, right, to be able to do things, is not something that we do automatically. It's a struggle. If you've ever had an exercise routine of any kind, right, you know the temptation to make excuses every morning when it comes time to go exercise. You know the temptation halfway through to say, oh, I wonder if today I can stop here if it's not far enough. We struggle to be persons, to be consistent, to hold on to our values across these different situations. Because the reality is, we do take a lot of cues from our environment. I think one of the more dramatic examples is a classic experiment in social science. In the situation, what they do is they bring subjects in and they think they're going to sit down to take a test, and they sit down and the examiner leaves the room, goes into the other room where there's a loud crash, and then they start screaming in pain. If the subject comes in alone and is sitting in the room alone, when they hear that crash in the other room, 70% of them get up to go see what's happened, to see if they can help to do something about it. So 70% of them do it. But in the other scenario, they bring them into a room with one other person, somebody who's in on the experiment, and that person's job is to sit there. They don't respond. They don't get up. So when you're in a room with one other person and there's the crash in the other room, 7% of people get up. So the swing is from 70% of people are willing to go help down to 7% of people are willing to go help, all because the other person in the room didn't do anything. So I think this is one of the challenges we often have in living up to our values. That is, when our values are out of sync with what the rest of the world is doing, what the other people around us are doing, with the ways other people behave, we seem to experience a substantial pressure to let go of those values, to respond to the circumstance, to say that what everybody else is doing is okay. I mean, 70% of people think that they should get up and are willing to do that. Only 7% of people are willing to do that when the other person in the room won't do it. So we tend to conform. We tend to read off what other people do. I think there's another possibility of why we don't tend to live up to our values. And that's that we don't really value what we say we value. I'm thinking, I can think of signs down the road where people have, there's a billboard not far away that has been owned by some company that periodically advertises campaigns, supporting Trump and things like this. And the other things they post are about kindness and compassion. And I'm like, you can't see these two things and not see attention. Which do you really value? Which thing is more important to you? Now, it's easy to point at other people and say they don't do that, but I think we have a tendency to do that with ourselves, that there are values that sound good, right? You'd say, oh yes, I definitely would do something about poverty if I saw it, if I could. When really very few of us do as much about poverty as we absolutely could, right? We're nowhere near our limit to say we just couldn't do another thing. A more complicated problem is that often I don't think we grasp what we value very clearly. That is, we don't understand exactly what it is that we value. If we think about something like compassion, right? We say, okay, well, maybe there's something valuable there, but if I don't know what that is or how it is or what sense it makes to me, and I don't think about it, then it can be hard for me to act on it. It's sort of easy to say, right, I should be kind or I should be compassionate. But if I don't really understand why I should be kind or compassionate, like what is it about that is important to me, then it's easy to be mean to somebody when they're mean to me, or it's easy to get angry, right, and act on that anger. If I grasp the value of compassion more clearly, understood why it was important to me, maybe I would be better at resisting the temptation to get angry or to be cynical. One more option, of course, is that we don't stop and take the time to think. And some of us were talking about this before. But I think that's one of the big stories that came across with hacking your mind. Like all of these shortcuts that our minds use, looking at what other people are doing, right? Trying to respond to what we've done before, but responding to various cues in our environment. All of these shortcuts come as efforts to try to save time and energy. So if we want to live according to our values, then it means we've got to periodically back up, right? Step back and think about what we're doing. Like, how are we actually ordering our lives? How are we actually making choices? If we just get up on Monday morning and do, respond to the first email in the inbox and the second one and the third one, we never take that chance to back up. We're not going to be living according to our values completely. A last option that came up that I was thinking about is the way that people might struggle to identify with values entirely. They may struggle with the identity that particular values give them. Example here that came out to me is this word feminism that we talked about a bit last week. For some women, that is a very difficult thing to identify with. For some men, it can be a difficult thing to identify with, even when they tend to actually agree with all the various purposes. Like they can say, yeah, I agree that that's a good thing and that's a good thing and that, but I can't think of myself as a feminist, right? That label becomes a challenge for them. And so I think that does make people reluctant to act, right? Because they don't want to have that label apply to them, or they think they're faking it if they try to take it on, like they're pretending to be, woke or whatever it might be. And they don't want to do that. So they resist moving in that direction. That one to me is kind of interesting. And it makes a bit of a transition to what we can do about it, because allowing for a certain amount of hypocrisy in terms of people's identities seems to actually be productive for helping them be better. The example that was used recently, that somebody else used recently that I listened to, is a fellow who was a vegetarian was talking to some other people. And one guy said, well, he's a vegetarian too, except that he eats fish. And he was judgmental at the moment and said, well, then you're not, right? I mean, it's just like, clearly that's not what it means. You're a pescatarian. But later, some others who had been engaged in this activism for a while said, look, let him have the label. Let him call himself vegetarian, except, because that's going to increase the chances that someday he starts to move away from eating the fish. We might say the same thing about feminism, right? Somebody who falls short in a number of ways, if they start using that label for themselves, even while they still fall short, they might start aspiring to be a little bit better. If, on the other hand, we call them out, right, for that gap, if on the other hand, they're told, no, you're not, you don't fit, they might never change. Or thinking about myself, just because I'm an imperfect feminist, right, doesn't mean I shouldn't think of myself as a feminist and try to be more like that. So what else can we do? What else works? There are various things that help us live better by our values. And I think that's one of the things, that's what I want to talk about in the discussion. But one simple thing that works is having reminders around you. So if you aspire to be, more kind, then things around you that have that word on them that say kind actually do help people become more kind. Just being able to look up and see it, right, and think about it. Many religious groups do this already. It's kind of interesting. Like they've already hacked your mind in this way, right? And they post their reminders for how you should be in various ways. But this works for humanists too. I mean, we can certainly make sure that we remind ourselves periodically about what our values are and the directions we want to go. Another thing that seems important is not just to discuss it rationally, but to have a good role model, to think about role models for being better, to think about individuals that you want to be like. We seem to think better in that way. The third possibility involves these situations, right? With the examples that I gave before, were about the way that situations could hack our minds and make us work differently. Well, then the solution obviously is to avoid those situations where you're going to be tempted to behave badly. I think we all know this with food, right? If you're trying to eat less, if you don't want to use many potato chips, then don't buy them, because if they're in the house, you're going to. Just get yourself out of the situation where you might do this. And the other way to think about it is to seek out situations where you'll behave better. If you're more likely, right, to behave the way the people around you behave, then think carefully about who you're around and when you're going to be around them. And the last one, perhaps the most important one, is knowing yourself clearly. That is, you need to know your particular tendencies, the areas where you're likely to, let yourself be hacked, the areas where you're likely to fall short, and be working on those deliberately. Which is back to what I started with, right? That's going to require that you see yourself clearly, not this sort of idealized vision of ourselves where we're not, where we don't have these ordinary vices, but to be able to see ourselves as having those vices and think in a sense that it's okay to be somebody that has some of these ordinary vices. It's just not okay to be somebody who has ordinary vices and isn't trying to get better and isn't willing to work on them. So those are some suggestions that are out there for, ways to get better, ways to try to live more in accord with your values. But in the discussion, I'd like to talk about other ways people fall short, ways they've tried to get better, all of those kinds of things.